Hello, tiny people. Here we go again. This time we're talking about the fact that Abraham Lincoln just could not find the right general to lead his armies during the early part of the war. This man's name was Henry Halleck. Now, Lincoln had tried before. He tried with Winfield Scott, but Winfield Scott was too fat to sit on a horse, and he's too old to do it anyway, so he wasn't going to work as a battlefield commander. Then he tried Irwin McDowell at First Bull Run, and Irwin McDowell just got kicked. So that didn't work. So he tried once again with George McClellan. And McClellan, of course, was just too hesitant. Lincoln thought he found the answer in the man on the left. His name is Henry Halleck, and he was commander of part of the Western Theater of the war. A theater is a large area of operation. So there was the East, and then there was the West over at kind of on the western side of the Mississippi. It looked as if Halleck was the guy because there had been lots of Union victories, some good sized over there in the West. But the problem was it was Henry Halleck's command, but beneath Halleck, one of the other generals was U.S. Grant, and it was actually Grant who was winning the battles. He was the guy. Henry Halleck was kind of a paper pusher. I mean, if you needed toilet paper ordered, he was your guy. You needed some more tents or saddles or blankets or whatever, he could get that for you. But leading an army on a battlefield, no, that wasn't anything Henry Halleck could do. And Lincoln actually even gave Halleck the plan. He said, look, that green dot incidentally is Richmond. He said, we already have an army down in the peninsula. That would be the line in dark blue. Said you need to start McClellan and that huge Army of the Potomac back up from the tip of the peninsula where he retreated and have him attack Richmond again. But knowing that Robert E. Lee doesn't have as many men as the North does, I'm going to send a second army from Washington, D.C., under a general named John Pope to attack at the same time. Now, the idea was John Pope and 50,000 men would come from the north, and then McClellan, who had now been replenished and resupplied and had a full 130,000 men on the peninsula, would come up from the south. And together they'd do a pincer movement, like tweezers, on the city of Richmond. Lincoln firmly believed that there was no way in the world that Robert E. Lee could summon enough men to fight off 180,000 men. And as a matter of fact, it really looked as if Robert E. Lee at the time only had about 60,000 men. Well, the first thing Lee did was split his army again, and he sent Stonewall Jackson and 25,000 men up to chase John Pope out around the Washington, D.C. area to keep that army from coming any further south. Now, Stonewall Jackson was a feared guy in the North. As a matter of fact, when parents would tuck their children into bed, they'd say, you be good, you stay in bed, or Stonewall will get you. They were afraid of Stonewall Jackson. Well, Stonewall Jackson went up and he engaged Pope just little bits and pieces, and then he fell back. And while John Pope and his army marched all over northern Virginia looking for Stonewall Jackson, Stonewall Jackson went to the old battlefield of the First Bull Run. And then he entrenched and waited. He built up the fortifications. He got ready to face Pope when Pope came. That's a very unusual thing to do because military people have some very strong beliefs, and one of them is the sacredness of a battlefield, particularly one where that person had fought before, and he's thinking back on the friends and the comrades that he had lost in the battle who might be buried close by. So this was a very unusual move. But you have to understand again, Stonewall Jackson was a religious fanatic. He believed in his cause and he believed that it was just and that God was on his side. So whatever happened to him was completely unimportant. And he wasn't afraid of a spirit or a curse or anything like that because he knew God was on the Confederate side, at least in his mind. Well, plan was John Pope coming south, and he'd had to hesitate to face Stonewall Jackson. And then George McClellan was supposed to come up the peninsula. Henry Halleck went down onto the peninsula to discuss matters with McClellan. And of course, McClellan brought along his old friend Alan Pinkerton, his intelligence officer, the guy who sized up the enemy army. And Alan Pinkerton had convinced McClellan that Robert E. Lee had well over 100,000 men. He had a huge army. And they managed to convince Henry Halleck of the same thing. Therefore, amazingly enough, when all Henry Halleck had to do was to say, on your mark, get set, go, and start two armies at the same time, instead, he did send John Pope down, who was facing Stonewall Jackson, and then Halleck ordered McClellan to abandon the peninsula. So instead of the Second Army moving up the peninsula again, they got onto boats and they returned to Washington, D.C. Now, on August 29th, Pope finally found Stonewall Jackson, and he attacked. It was hard, but Stonewall Jackson managed to hold. On the 29th, that night, John Pope sent Abraham Lincoln a telegram saying, "Oh, I have won a startling victory over Stonewall Jackson. This is amazing. I'm so good." Yet, during the night, Robert E. Lee came up with James Longstreet, another Corps commander from the South. Lee had divided his army at that point into three corps. That's three parts, three big units of the army. Stonewall Jackson had won already at Bull Run, and now James Longstreet and Robert E. Lee come up with a second. Lee takes command of the whole army, and the following day, on August 30th, Pope attacked what he thought was left of Stonewall Jackson's 25,000 men. Instead, Robert E. Lee has brought with him nearly 40,000 men. Pope is outnumbered, and Pope is crushed. This is a serious Union defeat. Let's talk about the Confederate high water mark. It came about now in September of 1862. Years ago, I canoed down the Mississippi River, and I was just amazed when we'd stop at buildings along the way. All the ones down in the valley, in the river valley, would have lines on the walls and numbers. I wasn't quite sure what that was, but then the locals told me those are the years and how high the water came when the Mississippi flooded. This is a picture. It is not 1862. Ladies didn't dress that way back then. But you can see how high the water rose in this flood line. That's the high water mark. And for the Mississippi, that is as big and powerful as the river got before it began to recede and eventually fade away. The Confederate high water mark. You've noticed the Confederates have been winning a lot of battles and doing a remarkable job. Well, the high water mark came in 1862 in September. That is as big and powerful as the Confederacy would ever become before it started to recede and shrink and it faded away. Think of what Robert E. Lee had done. He had taken over the Army of Northern Virginia near Richmond after Joe Johnston had been wounded. He defeated the Army of the Potomac under George McClellan, and that army was more than twice the size of his. And then he defeated the army that had been sent down to save the army that was twice his size. So this was a remarkable job. But still, it wasn't enough for the thing the Confederates needed most. Robert E. Lee and Jefferson Davis, the president of the Confederacy, agreed that if they would invade the North, that then Europe would recognize them, most particularly the British. The British mills wanted that Southern cotton. Oh, I guess Madison was not happy with the idea of a quiz on Friday. Come on, sweetheart, you can do this thing. So there were two reasons for Robert E. Lee's first invasion. The first one was to gain allies from Europe, most particularly the British. If they could get the British Navy in on their side, the British would sweep away the American Navy, and then the Confederate ports would be open to sell all that cotton. Then they could buy whatever supplies of war. They could hire mercenaries. They could bring in weapons. They could bring in food. They could bring in everything that they were being starved of through the Anaconda Plan. So the first reason was to gain allies from Europe. The second reason, pictured on the right there, is to bring the devastation of war to the north. There had been a lot of battles, a lot of destruction, but to this point, it had all happened in the South. So the South had faced this devastating ruin, and it was rather easy for the North to say, well, yeah, we read about this, but we don't see our cities being wrecked. We don't see our economy being ruined. So the second reason was to bring the destruction of war up north. There was another reason, and that was that supplies were growing thin for the army of the Confederacy down in the South. They hoped to resupply when they moved into Maryland. They also hoped with a victory that Maryland would join the Confederacy. Well, Robert E. Lee moved his army north, and he divided it into three sections, three parts. And now, in that day and age, what they had to do was write out orders. Those are actually Lee's orders off on the right. And they were written out not by Robert E. Lee himself. He didn't have time to write all those orders because they would have to go to any number of people to make sure that all the armies were coordinated. One of the officers, and we don't know who it was, but one of the officers carried a cigar case, much like that one down on the lower right. That's what that's for. A man could put a couple of cigars in there, and there were various sized these. But he could put a couple of cigars in there and carry them in his pocket without worrying about the cigars being crushed. And almost all men smoked cigars back then, all the soldiers anyway. Well, inside this cigar case, one of the Confederate officers had rolled up Lee's orders and carried them with him. As they rode up north, they stopped, and they must have enjoyed a smoke, and instead of putting the cigar case back into his pocket, it is assumed that this officer must have laid it on a log he was sitting on or near him in the grass, and then forgot about it when he rode off to rejoin the Southern Army going north. It was found by some Union privates, and they moved it up the chain of command because it looked rather important. And it moved on up until it got to McClellan's headquarters. McClellan looked at the detailed orders of exactly where every part of Lee's army would be, and McClellan thought it was a trick. He said, this is meant to trap me. They want me to move here, and no, I'm not going to do that. And so he wasted this magnificent opportunity, but one of the members of his staff knew personally the member of Robert E. Lee's staff who had written this out. And he said, General McClellan, this isn't a trick. These are real. These are Lee's orders. And with that in hand, McClellan thought, finally, I can beat Bobby Lee with this. But McClellan made a serious mistake. Instead of going after Lee's army while it was divided in three, McClellan waited and went to meet it at the point where the three parts of Lee's army would draw together. It was near a small town of Sharpsburg, Maryland, near Antietam Creek. So this battle, like most Civil War battles, has two names, Sharpsburg, Antietam. On September 17, 1862, the two sides fought to a draw. It was the bloodiest single day of the Civil War. There were other battles which were larger and bloodier, but they lasted 2 or 3 days. This was the bloodiest day of the war. The next day, Lee decided that he would hold and wait for McClellan to attack him, but McClellan, who of course thought he needed more in order to win, just waited and watched Lee's army. And on the night of the 18th, Robert E. Lee decided that he could not really win. He couldn't get past McClellan's army, so he couldn't attain the purpose of his invasion. Therefore, he quietly retreated back into Virginia. In the aftermath, because they had gone up north and lost, none of the European countries recognized the Confederacy. They did not join into any kind of an alliance with them. The North had lost 12,000 men, the South 11,500. And again, those are casualties. Those are soldiers wounded, either killed or wounded so badly they cannot continue to fight. To show you how intense the fighting was on that first day, part of it took place in a cornfield, and there were a number of attacks there. The cornfield had been just about ready to harvest. It was full stalks, straight up, probably 7-8 feet tall. And when the battle was over at the end of the day, there was nothing higher than about an inch off the ground. It had all been shot away. The 2nd Wisconsin Regiment ended the day with 1,203 soldiers. At the end of the day, there were 19 who were not casualties. 19 out of 1,203 had survived the day fully intact. The 132nd Pennsylvania was going through an apiary. That is not a place where they keep apes. That's a place where they keep bees. We were going through an apiary when one of the Confederate shells struck the beehives, turning the bees loose and angry, and many members of the 132nd Pennsylvania were stung to death. Finally, at the right is a general for the Union Army named Ambrose Burnside. Now, if you take a look at those great big pork chops, the hair coming down in front of his ear and across his cheeks, the man's name is Ambrose Burnside, and yes, you guessed it, the sideburn is named after him. Ambrose Burnside was supposed to come up and support McClellan's flank, that is the side of his army. And Burnside came to that bridge, which you see in the smaller picture. And he decided, wow, the creek's kind of wide at this point. I need to capture that bridge. So he fought all morning, losing hundreds of men. Finally, they captured the bridge. They got across, chased the Confederates away, had full control of the bridge, and then discovered that Antietam Creek at that point is a foot or less deep the whole way across. They could have simply run across it anytime during the morning. All right, ladies and gentlemen, that's the Battle of Sharpsburg-Antietam. It is Lee's first invasion. He would try again later. It was not successful for the South. The North held, the South retreated, but McClellan had the chance in his hand to crush the South. He could have wiped out Lee's army or at least captured it. First of all, when the Southern Army was in 3 parts, McClellan could have attacked any of the 3 parts with overwhelming force. He did not. He chose to let Lee get his army back together again. Secondly, after the first day's fighting, which was horrendous, he could have again used the force of numbers and crushed Lee's army. He did not. He allowed Lee to escape. Remember what we talked about. This is a war. This is a fight to the finish. And in a fight, it's not over until either one of the participants is dead or unable to continue the fight or surrenders. Thank you, ladies and gentlemen. Don't forget, you have a quiz coming up on Friday. It will be a gloriously good time. Thank you. I have Q&A coming up for the Jefferson and Madison classes on Wednesday morning, which will be the day you see this, hopefully. And I wish you all the best of luck, my friends. It is the Adams section, which is doing the essay part, everybody else online quiz. And Madison, try to adjust that attitude, dear. Hasta la vista, babies.